Awesome. Hey, everyone. My name's Jack. I'm a developer at a company called GoCardless, just up the road in Angel. Today I want to talk to you about ECMAScript 6, and more specifically, the Es6 Module standard. When I used to do this talk, I used to do it as a bunch of slides showing you the spec, and then I'd end with, and you'll probably use this in 2 or 3 years' time, because that's how JavaScript works. But actually, since then, there's a bunch of tools that have kind of grown out to let us use all this stuff today. And rather than show you a bunch of boring slides about ES6, the module spec, how we can use it, how we might use it further down the line, instead I'm just going to kind of build something very quickly to show you how this stuff kind of all comes together. Also really well timed in terms of React and the latest version kind of really embracing ES6 classes as well, so we'll get a bit of that along the way. So just to prove it to you, I've got absolutely nothing in this directory, React on the night, and we're going to build it all up from scratch. What we're going to use primarily is a tool called jspm, and this stands for the JavaScript Package Manager because we needed more package managers for JavaScript. What jspm is, it's a package manager that can install things both from npm and from other sources such as GitHub. It will also install a bunch of libraries like the SystemJS, which is a universal module loader for JavaScript. So it can load common JS modules, AMD format, and just things that export globally, along with ES6 as well, using a library called the Es6 Module Loader. It will also deal and help us with transpilation. We can do that through something like Babel or Tracer too. So really, this tool is kind of at the heart of the talk, and everything we do will go through JSPM. Really awesome. Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll agree, and I would really advise you to go and check it out. So the first thing I'm going to do is run npm init in my directory. And this is going to give me a package.json file that represents my project. The main reason I want this is because we're going to install a few dependencies, and I want to store them in package.json so that anyone else can grab the repo, download it, run npm install, and just get everything set up. Once we've done that, I'm going to do jspm init because we need multiple inits. And this is just running the jspm tool and kind of configuring our project. Most of these I'm just going to hit enter for. There's only one of interest, which is this one. It's asking me which ES6 transpiler I'd like to use. Tracer is the default. I think Babel is generally a much better option for a few reasons, which I can't really cover tonight. We'll come across a couple of them. In my experience, Babel is much better at errors when you mess up the syntax, which for me in particular is really useful, as I seem to do that quite a lot. And once I've told it I want to use Babel, it's going to download a few things. You can see that it's downloaded the ES6 module loader, it's downloaded SystemJS, and it's also going to grab Babel from npm as well, as you can see, and just go and basically set a bunch of stuff up. So now, if I clear that right at the top, we've gained a config.js. This is a configuration file that JSPM will maintain. You can edit it too, but on the whole, JSPM kind of will update that for you when it needs to. Package.json, which was created by npm, and then this JSPM packages folder, which you can kind of think of as like a node modules folder, if you like. We're not going to check this into version control. And what you would do if you wanted to take this project and work on it, you would clone the repository, run npm install, and then jspm install, and have everything just there for you. So all the dependencies live, but are managed by JSPM and don't end up in Git. Cool. I'm also going to make a directory called app, which is where all our source is going to live. And what we've got at the moment is I'm just serving this folder locally on localhost 3000. And right now, there's nothing there. This view is given to me by the module called serve, which is just what I'm using to kind of run this stuff locally. But we've got nothing going on. Another great thing about Babel, and another reason why I picked it for this project in particular, is that it comes with JSX transpiling and compilation all for us out of the box, which is really nice. It means you kind of keep the dependencies down. We don't need to use another tool to convert JSX to JavaScript or like a task running in the background all the time. Unfortunately, you do have to do a bit of configuration to get that running under JSPM at the moment. You need to go into Babel options and explicitly set the blacklist, which is a list of kind of plugins not to run, and just set it actually to an empty object. By default, ES6 Module Loader adds React to the blacklist for Babel. That's going to change in the 0.17, the upcoming version, but for now, you just need to explicitly tell it not to blacklist anything. Cool. So now let's actually see if we can get something going in the browser. I'm going to create an index.html file and use this handy little shortcut I've got to spit out a bunch of HTML. We're loading in SystemJS, which was installed for us by JSPM. That's the universal module loader. It can take modules in a bunch of different formats and load them in. We need that. Config.js, which we'll look at in a bit more detail later, which is all the JSPM configuration. And then we see kind of the first bit of new exciting JavaScript, this system.import. One of the things SystemJS does is it polyfills the new system API that will eventually come to JavaScript. Import is just a way of effectively doing exactly what you'd imagine, importing that file and kind of running it. So this is looking for the file called main.js inside the app directory. There's no need to put the .js extension on. And you can do a bunch of stuff with system.import. They return you promises. You can chain them. You can load a bunch of things at once. You can catch if something goes wrong and do all sorts of stuff that I unfortunately don't have time to go into. But it's a really nice API. And my first step whenever I do something in live coding is just to prove that it is working. So I'm going to go to app, do main.js, and of course, we're going to go for a hello world. So if I've run all this correctly, we have console, we see hello world there, which is a few deep breaths. What's particularly cool about this is if we take a look at the network tab, and I usually just hit exit rather all, you can see that it's pulled in a bunch of different things here. It's pulled in SystemJS and config.js there in the HTML, but it's also pulled in the Es6 module loader because it realized that it needed that to pull this in. And this is a general theme of jspm in that when you need an extra dependency, jspm most of the time will have just taken care of it for you. And one of the things I'd advise is as you watch me do this talk, hopefully you'll kind of get the sense it all feels too good to be true. When I install a thing with jspm and it just works, it's typical kind of front-end development like that. Nah, that doesn't work in real life. We've run jspm at work on a few fairly large projects. There are a couple of other big companies doing it too. On the whole, this stuff genuinely does just work, honestly. So I really would kind of bear that in mind. It's really, really quite impressive. Cool. So what we're going to build is a really small app that can basically take a GitHub username, like mine, Jack Franklin, and just list some of my open source repositories on the page. And to do that, we're going to need something to make HTTP requests. There's a new API coming to the browsers called Fetch, which is actually, as of like last week, in Google Chrome now. This is stable Chrome as well. This isn't Canary. So the new Fetch API works. You could say that Chrome made Fetch happen. That was funnier than you gave me credit for. So Fetch is a new API for making HTTP requests and kind of dealing with them. It's in Chrome, but it's not in other browsers yet. So what I tend to do is just install a polyfill to kind of pull it in. And we can do this using jspm. So I'm going to do jspm install, and then npm, which just tells jspm to go and get this package from npm. And the package happens to be called whatwd-fetch. The one good thing about doing a talk at the Facebook offices is Wi-Fi is not an issue. So that pulls down Fetch, and it's installed. You see here, that line, it says installed whatwd-fetch. That effectively means it's installed the module whatwd-fetch as npm:/whatwd-fetch, and so on. It's effectively set up a mapping, so it's mapping that whatwd-fetch to the npm fetch with the version module. And we can now import this into main.js by just saying import whatwd-fetch. So this is our first glimpse at the new Es6 module syntax. This is just going to go and import that file. SystemJS and jspm have set up all the mappings to make this work. And if we were to refresh, we would see that this file is loaded in. We won't actually see any difference. If I hit fetch, I'm still going to get native code. And that's because the polyfill, thankfully, just if fetch is supported, just doesn't do anything. If this was a real project, I'd probably conditionally load this module in if I wasn't in a browser that had fetch, and rather than just waiting to make the HTTP request and then let itself do the check. But for now, this will work fairly well. When we're importing this in, whatwd-fetch will export the global fetch variable, and that's why we don't need to assign the result of importing this file in, because it just dumps something into the browser, it polyfills. One thing, though, is that typing whatwd-fetch is a bit kind of weird. I'd expect to just be able to type install fetch. And there's a few modules where this is the case. The published name on npm or GitHub is a bit longer than the actual name due to naming conflicts. And to get around this, you can say install, and you do fetch equals. And what this does is it's going to install exactly the same package, but it's just going to map it to a different name. So I've now told jspm that I want to refer to this module as fetch. And now if I can just do that and refresh, and nothing is going to break. And we look down the line, you see right at the very bottom, fetch.js was pulled in for us. So we now have something that can make requests. We had it anyway in Chrome, but obviously we wouldn't have it in other browsers. Cool. So that's kind of dull, I appreciate, but we're now kind of in a position where we can take React and actually start doing something with it. So I'm now going to go in here and type jspm install React. I kind of did this on purpose. There's a reason that I kind of do it, and you'll notice that when it's gone right to the top. When I typed jspm install React, I didn't prefix it with npm:/. So the natural question there is why? How did it know to go and find React? And it searched and it found it there. You can just say it says installed React as npm:/React. The reason that's the case is because JSPM has this registry. The registry is effectively a massive JSON file of mappings. So when you say JSPM install X, it just maps that and installs something else. The registry commonly is full of SystemJS plugins and also modules that have either that are very popular, React being one, obviously, Angular, all the big frameworks, or Bootstrap, and so on, or just modules that have a bit of a funky name. Anyone's able to make a pull request and contribute to this to add a new mapping. And if we search, we'll see React. And you see React here is just mapped to npm:/React. So when I do jspm install React, it goes and looks at this mapping first, and then it just maps it to npm React, and so on. Cool. All right, so let's just do the typical React hello world. So this time I'm going to do import React from React. So this is importing. There are two types of exports in the new ES6 module specification. There are named exports, which we'll see in a bit, and there are also default exports. A module can have many named exports, but can only have one default export. The default export is the main thing that this thing exports. In case of React, it's React. jQuery would be the dollar, and so on. So I'm just basically, by doing this, by typing this, I'm grabbing the default export from the React module and assigning it to the variable React. I can then create a new ES6 class called hello world, and we're going to extend. Let me just close this one to get a bit more space. And we can extend React dot component like that, and I'll just do render hello world. This is the last hello world, honest. And then we do React.render. I'm just going to chuck it in the body for simplicity. And hopefully, if we refresh now, I made a mistake. So actually, I talk about this later on, but by making a purposeful mistake, we can come across it earlier. This is one of the main reasons I enjoy Babel over Tracer. If this was Tracer, this error would still be pretty clear, but not quite as clear. Babel is really good at spotting errors and just dumping it onto the console. And we can see the mistake. I've typed extend, and I meant extends. But that's really cool. And that's one of the big benefits I've found for Babel is this. One of the big problems when you're transpiling all your code is coming back to the original error and figuring out what actually went wrong. This is really good at handling it. I mean, pair programming with 200 people and none of you spotted that. It's kind of disappointing, but we'll move on. And you can see just in the top left, we do have hello world. So we're pulling in React, and we're running it. What's also cool, if we were to look in the network tab, we've also pulled in Babel, which we weren't pulling in earlier when I was just doing console.log hello world. So SystemJS is clever enough to spot when you need Babel and just pull it in. And that's kind of the general theme. It spots when you need a certain dependency and will just take care of everything else. Really, really nice workflow. So we've done our hello world. So if this was a real app, I'd probably next start working on an API module. And this would contain a bunch of methods for making various types of requests to my specific API. In my case, I'm just going to use the GitHub API as a very easy example. I'm going to create a function called repos for user. And this is a function that takes a username and will make an AJAX request to the API to pull in a list of repositories for that user, and then return a promise that will either resolve or reject when the response is made, or the request is made, sorry. So I'm going to say let URL, and I'm going to use new ES6 template strings to interpolate this thing, which, as someone who writes a lot of Ruby day to day, it was rejoicing when this came into the language. Repos. And I don't think I made a typo. And then we're going to use the new fetch API, return the URL, and I'm going to chain a callback in using arrow functions as well, full ES6, and response.json, which will just pass the response from JSON into an actual JavaScript object for us. Then right at the bottom, I'm going to say export repos for user. And notice here, this is what's called a named export. The reason it's a named export is because I'm wrapping the export in curly braces, effectively exporting an object full of keys and values. And by doing so, I'm exporting a named export called repos for user. So this is the case. This API module might have 4 or 5 different methods to make different API requests. And you could export them all individually like this. The main difference between a named and a default export is clearer, though, when we actually pull it in. So if I go back into main.js, I'm going to now type import repos for user from /API. So notice I'm using the curly brackets over this side as well, both in the import and export. So this is pulling out that one function from that API and giving it back to me. Then again, let me just prove to myself that I haven't messed up. I'm going to say repos for user Jack Franklin, .then repos, and we'll just console.log them. This is mainly for me to make sure that I haven't made a mistake. I have totally typoed the URL. Aha. Cool, so we now have this big list from GitHub, and it is a bunch of repositories. As an aside, when I first did this, someone pointed this out to me. I didn't know this at all. If you've console.logged an object or an array, something like that, to the console in Chrome anyway, you can right-click and click Store as Global Variable, and then get this temp1 variable, which is the thing you just consoled. That's the most valuable bit of this talk, to be honest. This really has changed entirely how I debug things, and it's been really nice to kind of find that out. So you take anything away from this, none of that ES6 stuff, it's Google Chrome's console. Cool. So we now have a big array of repositories, and I want to build a component called repository list, which will just take some and spit out a big list. So let's create app/repository list.js. At the top, I need to import React again. I'm going to export. I'm going to do a default export now. The big difference with a default export is that it's not named. It's just kind of exported as a thing. And we're going to export a default class. I'm going to call it here. I can call the class repository list. And again, it's going to extend react.component. And again, sanity check will just render p some repositories. I've missed return as well. Cool. If I go into app main.js, I can import this repository list from /repository list. Should have picked shorter names. And then down here, I can just return, let's just wrap this and say div open source. OK, and we'll have a look again. And we get open source and then some repositories. Cool. So this is the real, when I talk about ES6 and React, this is what I mean. And I found this a really nice approach to building applications, is just having lots of files that export a default class, which is a React component, and pulling those in. What's really cool about this as well is that none of this stuff breaks. If I open it again, there's a really weird bug in the React inspector, which I haven't quite figured out. But hopefully, this stuff doesn't break the React inspector either. And it all just kind of works as you would expect. So that's been really nice as well. So often when you're transpiling, doing all sorts of clever stuff, lots of tools break. In this case, everything works pretty seamlessly. Apart from, for some reason, you have to open it in a new tab to get it to pick up that it's a React app. I've not entirely figured that one out, but that's really nice. OK. So again there. So now what I'd like to do is actually move the logic for fetching these repositories into the repository list component. In ES6 React land, there's no getInitialState anymore. You instead override the constructor. The constructor is called with some props. And we just call super on the props to hand those off. And then I'm just going to say this.state equals a thing with an empty array of repositories. And then on component did mount, we're going to do repos for user Jack Franklin. Then, come on, repos. And I'm just going to do this.set state repos. Cool. One really cool thing about ES6 arrow functions, very quickly, is the common mistake here is instead of doing that, I have this. And then this in there is the window, or undefined if you're in use strict mode, and then everything goes wrong, and we post on Stack Overflow. But with arrow functions, they maintain the scope. So that this inside the arrow function is going to point to the instance of the class. That's huge. It's really, really nice. And then for render, I'm now going to return a new paragraph with just this.state.repos. So we're just going to get, hopefully, a big blurb of text. It's going to be nothing too exciting yet. I'm also going to app/main and just delete that. we're not going to get that at all. Repos user not defined, of course. I forgot to import it. You know, this is another thing that's really cool, is all these modules, they don't leak onto the global scope. It's not just importing them and chucking them onto the global object. So the fact that I forgot to import here actually really does matter. So it's not some kind of cheat or anything, which is really nice. And now we do just get a massive blurb of text and a bunch of React warnings. I'm an Angular developer at my day job, though, so we'll just pretend you didn't hear that. Cool. So what we're going to do now is we're going to actually create the repo component, which is a very simple component that will represent a single repository. Again, we need to import React. That. We'll export default class repo. It's quite fiddly JavaScript, isn't it? And the render method here, and we return a list item. And so this .props.raw.name. Raw is going to be effectively the response from GitHub. And then just this .props.raw.description. Oh, what have I done? Oh, the line number's changed. I totally don't want that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the line number's changed just to make pair programming really awkward. Cool, that all looks good now. So then we can go back into, I do have notes, thankfully, back into the repository list. And I'm going to import my repo component. Probably see exactly where this is going. And then just going to update the render method and say var repos equals this.state.repos.map over each individual repository, and return, actually, I need to wrap it in an li here, and I'll go back and wrap it in a div over there, repo.id, like that. And then let's just change this. And I'll go back over here and just change this li to be a div. Eventually. Cool. And hopefully, if we refresh now, and we do, there we go, we have a big list of all my open source repositories, or rather the first page of all my open source repositories, most of which were abandoned about 3 years ago with about 2 commits, even though I was convinced they'd really make it on Twitter. Cool. So that's hopefully a very, very brief overview of how we can kind of get this running with jspm. It's a really nice workflow. I've already shown you something accidentally when things go wrong, but I also want to show a little other bit. So earlier I made that big typo when we saw the really nice error message from Babel, but it's also even cleverer. Say you want to really debug the render method of hello world, or a method. Now there is no way this should work. There is also no way that it should work and pause on the untranspiled code. But I chuck a debugger in, and you see it over here in Google Chrome that you do get the untranspiled source code. So debugging and that kind of thing is actually a much nicer experience than you might imagine. It all kind of somehow hangs together through wizardry and black magic. I've genuinely no idea how Babel does this and manages all this stuff. If anyone does know, I'd be really interested to find out. But the kind of key thing here is that I found debugging generally a much nicer experience than you might imagine. When I kind of first started working with things like Tracer and figuring out how to do transpilation, the debugging was a bit of a nightmare. But things like Babel and the tooling's really matured and become loads better. Cool. And just one final bonus bit, if I've got 2 minutes. The next question that people often ask me, let me just get rid of that, else I'll forget that that's a thing. The next question people ask me generally is, how do you then go about bundling this stuff up into production? In theory, this could be a bit of a nightmare. In actual fact, it's really, really easy. JSPM comes with a bundle command that can create a big bundle for you. And with a bit of extra work, you can easily get this all being chucked out into a nice index file that just links to a minified script. JSPM is also clever enough to know what it needs to bundle in. So if it needs the Babel runtime, it will bundle that in with it. All your code will get run through Babel before being spit out into the output file as well. So you end up just with an index.html file and one massive JavaScript file that represents your entire app with nothing else to be loaded in. I just want to very, very quickly, this is all on GitHub as well, so I won't go through this stuff in great detail. You can find it on GitHub, or feel free to come and ask me afterwards. I just want to show you kind of how easy it is to get that going. I'm going to need a couple of plugins, Untitled.js and HTML Dist. Yeah. So I won't explain this in great detail, all on GitHub. Feel free to grab me after the talk as well. Happy to chat more about it. Cool, those have been installed. I'm going to go old school and create a make file. We're going to have a build task. First thing it's going to do is remove a Dist directory if that happens to exist. It's then going to go ahead and make it again. By the way, for anyone who does actually use make, the dash at the beginning of the first line tells make to continue, even if that line errors. Only found out about that recently, and that's really been quite useful. I'm going to call jspm bundle minus sfx. This creates what's called a self-executing bundle. So it's going to minify all JavaScript together. You can chuck it into an HTML page, and it will just kind of kick itself off, if you like. You don't have to do any initial import or thing to trigger everything. Just do it all for you. And all you do is you give it the main kind of entry point of your app, which for me is main.js. And from there, it basically goes through and it finds all the imports, and it builds up the big graph and starts chucking stuff together. And I want to output that to dist/app.js. I'm then going to go ahead and uglify it. The main reason I do these in 2 steps as well is I found very rarely it's quite useful to have a big unminified output just to make sure nothing funky is going on as well. And then we're going to call HTML dist, which is potentially the longest command ever. HTML dist is a tiny little thing I wrote. It's literally about 20 lines of code, and it can take an HTML file and remove a bunch of script tags from it and then add a new script tag to it. It's effectively all it does. So I'm going to tell it to remove all the script tags, minify the HTML, just strips out any white space that it can, and then insert a new script tag pointed to app.min.js, and output that HTML file to dist/index.html. If I've done all that right, I should be able to run make build now. It creates a directory, it runs jspm bundle that bundles it all up, it then uglifies it, it uses HTML dist to spit out a new HTML file. If I now look at dist/index.html, you'll see it's basically stripped all the old script tags out, put a new one into app.min.js, you can just about see, and taken out all the excess white space. We have dist/app.js, which is only 11,226 lines long. And this is the entire unminified output. And then I'm not going to try and load it in Vim. It'll probably crash. We have app.min.js, which is obviously all squished together. And just to prove that this does actually work, I'm going to swap to serving the dist directory on the same port. And you can see that all works. You can also see, if I get rid of the filter, that we made no requests. We got app.min.js, we got some plugin stuff, and then repos is just the request to the actual GitHub API. So really, I think what you get with this stuff, you get a really nice dev workflow where everything's just loaded in on the fly for you. You don't have to worry. There's no task running in the background to compile any of the stuff in development. There's nothing going on. I'm just serving it locally using a tiny little module called serve. But then in production, it's very easy to pull this all together into a big bundle where it's all dealt with for you. If you'd like to have a look at this, I put this on GitHub, jackfranken/jspm-es6-react-example. Feel free to grab that out, have a look at stuff. It's effectively a clone of what I just wrote today. Other than that, you can go to jspm.io to find out more about JSPM and get links to SystemJS and all the other things that kind of under the hood of JSPM. Otherwise, I think that's just about it. So feel free to come and grab me. I'll be hanging around afterwards. Tweet me, email me, whatever. And thank you for listening. Someone over there with hands up. Any easy questions?
This is maybe not easy, but you said that you wanted to wrap fetch in an if statement.
Yeah.
And I'm curious how that works, because if you're going to bundle it up and import all the modules, how would it know to import it or not? Or does it import it?
Yeah, so you wouldn't be able to do that as seamlessly in terms of bundling. You'd have to have that conditional logic in your actual production output. Whether that's a good idea or not, it's up to you to decide. The way I would actually do that is this is completely unrehearsed. It'd be something like if window.fetch, or rather if not window.fetch. we'll get that. If not window.fetch, you would do like system.import fetch.then. There's definitely a better way of doing this, and then put that in there too. Else you would just do that, something like that. There's definitely a much better way of doing that, but that's the rough idea I had in my head.
And would that try and call a file over the network?
It would what, sorry?
Would that fetch it asynchronously via
Yeah, so this would make a HTTP request to fetch. That will return a promise. When that resolves, it will then call the callback, and that will then import app/main, which will kick everything off. But yeah, if you were doing this, you couldn't just minify all the HTML like I just did. You'd have to be a bit more clever about it. I mean, the build script I've got there is certainly not designed to be reflected of a big app build script. That's a rough idea, that very rough idea. What's Chris done there?
Hi, what happens if you have like 2 different versions of library in your packages? Like one of the packages pull in React 0.13 and then the other pulls in React 0.12. How does the jspm manage that?
Is that different versions?
Yeah.
That's a good question. No, I actually don't know, because no, I'm pretty sure it would deal with it, because you'll notice even though we're pulling in React, I believe if I were to go here, this is the big outputted one. We don't have React as a thing, so it's not actually exporting React. React isn't still making its way onto the global object. So I think it should deal with that. Someone's shaking their head. I also have a feeling that it flattens a bunch of dependencies, in which case it probably wouldn't. I'm looking at Patrick now because he's nodding at me. It won't load both. Cool. Right.
Basically, it relies on Semver, is the answer to that question.
I couldn't remember. So it'll flatten the dependencies and figure out which one it should use based on Semver.
Correct. Yes.
I knew that already, but
so in a happy world, it will try and use one. If for whatever crazy reason you're like a major release away on your 2 separate dependencies on React, then it will have to load both versions of React. But you should never really be pointing to 2 dependencies that have a major release of React anyway. You should just be points away, and then Semver and jspm will clean that out for you.
Cool, thank you. Can you come to every talk? Always, every time. Cool. The only other, very quickly, the guy who works on jspm, Guy Bedford, is really, really receptive to feedback and issues and pull requests and comments. I think I reported the bug and it was fixed 15 minutes later in a new release, which is kind of crazy. So I really would encourage you, if you do start using this thing, find issues, even if it's an issue with a particular package that you can't get being imported, even though you think it should just work. I'd really encourage you to report that. This guy's very responsive and very willing to answer questions along those lines as well. So if you get stuck, it's probably not you. I found a few bugs in a few specific packages and managed to fix them. So I would, if you do get stuck, please don't give up. Please do tweet me or better report an issue on jspm, and Guy will almost certainly fix it. He's a genius. Cool. Thank you.